Throughout the evening, I intermittently observed a pair of men lingering in a booth. One of the men occasionally approached other tables, while the other man continued to sit in the booth and drink. Typically, the man who remained in the booth approached tables occupied by women and engaged in brief conversations. Sometimes these conversations ended quickly, while at other times the man produced an envelope containing documents or pictures. The contents of these envelopes were unclear to me, but I assumed they were engaged in sales. I was surprised that the management hadn't intervened later that night. I mentioned this observation to my companions, my wife Christy, who I have been married to for 2 years, along with our friends Chris and his wife Liz and Heinz. His wife, Kim, and I briefly discussed their activities before moving on approximately 30 minutes later. The first man finally approached our table. I presumed he had exhausted his options with tables occupied predominantly by women and was about to reveal his intentions. He greeted us, inquiring about our well-being that evening. His tone was friendly and our responses were somewhat incoherent. He smiled at each of us before continuing, explaining that his friend, who was in town for the weekend on business, was seeking some company. He wanted to ascertain whether any of the ladies might be interested. I was taken aback by his audacity in approaching a table. Each woman was accompanied by her partner and was asked if she would be interested in accompanying his friend for sexual intercourse. Before I could express my thoughts, Liz spoke up, questioning the proposition. The man responded, explaining that his friend was well endowed and knew how to use it. He suggested that one of us might be interested in trying it. The women were barely holding back laughter, but the man seemed oblivious. Perhaps repeated rejection had made him immune. Kim took the next step, likely sparking the events that followed. How do we know he is really that well equipped? The man retrieved the envelope. The envelope he had been carrying all evening, which he had previously shown to several women, contained pictures of his friend. At this juncture, the men among us were content to let the women handle the situation, eagerly anticipating the moment this individual would be sent away. The women expressed visible admiration for the pictures. They reacted with exaggerated enthusiasm while Chris Hines and I observed with amusement at their antics. Then came the big proposition. What do you say, ladies? Do you have any interest? You won't regret it. Liz and Kim shook their heads and giggled as they returned. They turned the pictures to the man, who then stowed them back in the envelope. It appeared that he was preparing to depart and attempt his fortune elsewhere when he paused, focusing on Christy. Perhaps he discerned a resemblance in her eyes, prompting him to inquire again. What about you, young lady? I did not observe you shaking your head. I remained seated, however, in a somewhat misguided confidence, awaiting. Christy finally spoke, but her words were lost in the commotion. I was more focused on the man's response than on her words. To my surprise, he did not frown or remain composed. Instead, he grinned widely and walked over to Christy. It took a moment for me to register her words, "I'll go." By the time I had regained my composure, he had already. He then proceeded to remove her from the table and guide her towards the exit. It was unclear whether a signal had been given or if the second individual had simply understood the situation. However, he was already heading for the door as well. Our companions appeared as shocked as I was. I attempted to speak to Christy, but despite my shock, no sound came out. I then proceeded to physically restrain Christy from further interaction with the individual in question, preventing her from reaching the exit before they had the opportunity to do so. I then proceeded to question the bouncer's actions, inquiring about his rationale for his conduct. However, I was then abruptly restrained by a massive hand, which I was unable to resist, forcing me to release Christy. I then attempted to clarify the situation, informing the individual that Christy was my wife and that despite my protests, the bouncer maintained his grip, asserting his authority over the situation. He expressed regret for whatever was happening in my marriage but emphasized his duty to prevent violence. According to him, since Christy claimed she was leaving with them willingly, he couldn't allow me to touch her like that on their property. Even as he held me, Christy whispered something in his ear, prompting him to give her a strange look before glancing back at me and then at her again. He asked her if she was sure about her decision. Christy looked back at him. At this point, I appeared to regain my composure and affirmed her decision to the bouncer with a newfound confidence. As Christy proceeded towards the waiting men by the door, I urgently implored her to reconsider and return. However, she was undeterred and proceeded to join the two men and exit through the door. I presumed that the bouncer would release me once they were gone, allowing me to pursue them. However, when I attempted to pull away after the door closed, I discovered that I was still firmly restrained. I protested, inquiring as to why he was still holding me since they had departed the premises. I struggled against him, but my efforts were ultimately futile. I ceased my attempts to escape and instead regarded him with resignation, offering an apology for the situation. He then informed me that Christie had requested that I be held for a few more minutes, which meant that I was unable to follow the two men. Technically, the parking lot was still within the bounds of their property. I was suddenly struck by the realization that Christie had chosen to leave with the two men, having asked the bouncer to hold me for a few more minutes. The bouncer's actions effectively neutralized my ability to resist. Our companions remained in the vicinity, visibly affected by the sudden developments. After a few minutes, the bouncer released my arm, and I collapsed onto the floor, overcome with despair. I briefly caught a glimpse of pity on the bouncer's face before he departed, and the bar fell silent. As the drama came to a close, peripheral conversations gradually resumed. I sat on the floor, overcome with emotion, tears streaming down my face. I was left to ponder the question of why she had done this to me. Was I not enough for her? This painful realization gave me something tangible to act upon. Chris and Heinz helped me stand and guided me back to our table, where Kim and Liz tried to comfort me. At the table, Kim and Liz attempted to console me following Christie's abandonment and humiliation. However, upon observing Christie's empty seat, I felt compelled to leave. I left $140 on the table and proceeded to the door. Kim inquired as to whether I was departing. In response, I stated that there was no reason for me to remain and that I had obligations elsewhere. Liz inquired about waiting for Christie's return, but I dismissed the idea, suggesting that one of them offer her shelter for the night instead. I felt compelled to leave, and as I walked away, I heard the girls asking the guys to intervene, but they refused, stating that they would not do so after what she did. I focused on the door, avoiding the pity from everyone in the bar was palpable. I managed to reach my car before being overwhelmed by emotions again, feeling dizzy and on the verge of passing out. I sat in the driver's seat for several minutes until I felt well enough to drive home. As I sat there, I reflected on the irony that Christie's impulsive nature. I had previously been attracted to her, approximately halfway back to our apartment. Christie's number appeared on my caller ID, indicating that she may have changed her mind and required assistance. I answered the call without preliminary pleasantries and proceeded to offer assistance. However, my assumption was erroneous. I inquired about Christie's whereabouts and offered to retrieve her. She requested the hotel and room number, indicating that she did not want me to enter the room. I modified my approach, suggesting that she leave and I would pick her up outside. She stated that she was not leaving and wanted to stay, using pet names and expressing hope for my understanding. She emphasized that the issue was not about her or her feelings for me. I attempted to persuade her to reconsider, but she was adamant that she had to proceed with the act, assuring me that it would not negatively impact our relationship and that it was merely a one-time occurrence. I experienced a sense of numbness, not only due to her abrupt departure from the social gathering in the presence of our acquaintances, but also because she chose to contact me to share the news. She then asked if I was okay with it, which I found astonishing given the circumstances. I came to realize that there was little to be gained from pursuing the matter further. Consequently, I informed her that I understood her position, although my interpretation differed significantly from hers. She expressed gratitude and promised to demonstrate her affection once she had completed her task. With that, the call concluded, and the despondency and melancholy I had been experiencing suddenly dissipated. I had effectively blocked out the love I had for her just a few hours before, replacing it with a grim determination to move on. Upon reaching my apartment, I proceeded to unpack my luggage, which each of us had our own set from before we were married. I proceeded to spread all 3 suitcases out on the bed. Our respective belongings were not extensive, and what was mine was considerably less than Christie's. I had initially assumed that all of my belongings would fit within these 3 cases. However, in the event that they did not, I was confident that any items I wished to leave behind would not be missed. I took my time, as I had no intention of simply disappearing. In fact, I was anticipating that she would experience a similar level of distress when I departed from the apartment as I had when she left the bar. I had 2 suitcases that were nearly full and was in the process of packing the last one when I heard the front door open and then close quietly. She observed that the lights were on, indicating that I was awake, and she called to me. I responded by calling out for her to enjoy herself, although it seemed that my sarcasm was not readily apparent, given her response sounded as though she had just returned from a party. She entered the bedroom and I stole a glance at her. Her hair and makeup were disheveled, and her attire was disheveled, and she seemed content, yet her smile dissipated upon observing me packing. She inquired about my actions and I responded that I was relocating and initiating divorce proceedings. She advanced, attempting to halt my packing, but I firmly removed her hand from the suitcase, experiencing a surge of anger. Her grasp on my arm was reminiscent of the bouncer's grip. I informed her that I did not appreciate her touching me and that, according to my understanding, she intended to enjoy herself with the other men regardless of my feelings. I inquired as to whether she had engaged in sexual intercourse with both men, not just Mr. Big. My sarcasm was evident as she pleaded with me not to leave, explaining that she had always wanted to try a man of such considerable size and had never been with a well. She justified her actions by stating that it would not have been fair to leave Desmond in a compromising position after he had invested a significant amount of time and effort into the project. She also expressed her desire to avoid exploiting married women for personal gain. She assured me that the situation was over and that she was committed to our relationship. She was willing to do whatever was necessary to make amends. I expressed my disappointment to Christy. I reminded her that she had already promised to be mine forever when we got married. I questioned the significance of her promise now, considering she had already broken it once. I asked how she could possibly make up for what she had done. Despite this, I told her I would consider putting it behind us if she told me. Christy refused to divulge the hotel and room number where she had been taken, continuing to pack her belongings. She dismissed my request, stating that I should take a printout of her apology and shove it. She expressed concern that disclosing this information might result in me engaging in dangerous behavior, potentially leading to injury, given that there were 2 individuals involved. She asserted that the situation was not worth getting into trouble over. I countered that it was my decision to make, not hers. I asked her one more time for the hotel and room number. She apologized again, citing her promise to protect me when we got married. She refused to let me get hurt unless I was the one doing the hurting. My response seemed to strike a chord with her, and she finally relented. I completed my packing as she continued to attempt to persuade me to remain with her. Despite her efforts to reassure me that our encounter was merely sexual and that she was not intending to cause me any harm, I remained unwavering in my resolve to depart. When she finally conceded that our relationship was meaningless, I had reached my limit. I informed her in a firm manner that our sexual relationship was of significant value to me. I was unaware that it held little importance to you, but it was one of the aspects that made you distinctive. I was the only individual who had the opportunity to engage with your body, and you simply relinquished it. Furthermore, you did so in a highly humiliating manner. We were in a public setting. Given that our friends were present, she offered an apology, stating that she was aware of the situation and that it would not recur. She explained that she had acted on impulse but that she was now regretful and remorseful. I inquired about the possibility of other actions she might take in the future. I expressed disbelief and shame at her actions, recounting the entire bar had stared at me with pity and shame as she walked out without even looking back at me. She openly cried, pleading with me not to leave her and professing her love for me. I responded firmly, stating that if that was how she expressed love, I was not interested. I admitted that even if she had told me where to find them, there was no way I would stay. I informed her that I might eventually forgive her, but that I would never forget what she had done and how it made me feel. It took 2 trips, but I eventually loaded my suitcases into my car and drove away. Upon returning for a second time, Christy was still collapsed on the floor. She was able to look up at me as I entered and mumble, "Please." Despite my misgivings about the situation, I was reluctant to leave. I felt like an idiot for leaving like this. While there was no way I could still be with her, I still loved her. I was disoriented when I woke up in the hotel I had stayed in. I was more tired than I had anticipated. It appeared that the adrenaline had worn off, and once it did, I experienced a significant decline in energy levels. It was nearly noon before I regained consciousness. Fortunately, I had made advance reservations for 2 days, but I was aware that our financial resources would not sustain a hotel stay for an extended period. I required a place to stay. One challenge was the 3 months remaining on the lease for the apartment that Christy and I had shared. I had shared the apartment with my partner, and the cost of a new apartment would be exorbitant. I was forced to consider whether to simply accept the loss and abandon the apartment or devise an alternative plan. It was evident that my partner and I had minimal assets. Each of us owned a vehicle with corresponding payments, which would likely offset each other. The bank account was modest in size, and beyond that, there was only the furniture that we had purchased. I did not particularly care for it, I did not hate it, I simply did not care. I was reluctant to involve the other couples in the situation. However, Chris and Heinz had been my closest friends for years, even before the marriages of their wives. Chris and Liz had been married for 5 years. Heinz and Kim had been members of the club for almost 4 years. After finally turning my phone back on, I discovered numerous messages from Chris and several from the other men and their wives. They urged me not to do anything rash. One message from Chris stood out, offering to help in any way they could. I called them and got through to Chris. Liz contacted me via telephone to propose a solution. She suggested that I stay in their guest room for a period of time, but she would not conceal my whereabouts from Christy. She informed me that Chris had been inquiring with other individuals to ascertain whether they had received any communication from me. Liz asserted that I would at least maintain a civil demeanor towards Christy, acknowledging that she had made a misstep but emphasizing that the incident was not as grave as a homicide. I consented to Liz's conditions and proceeded to relocate from the hotel to their spare room the following morning. My supervisor permitted me to take the morning off, but I was obliged to work late one evening that week to make up for the lost time. I chose to work late that night to divert my attention from the events of the upcoming weekend. I arrived at Chris and Liz's residence shortly after 10 o'clock. I had hoped for some rest, but I was met with an unexpected encounter with Christy. I questioned her presence and reminded her that I had indicated that I did not want to see her when I left. She apologized, explaining that she was suffering without me and expressing a desire to talk and work things out. I reiterated that I was not interested in reconciling, but she pleaded with me not to end things because of one mistake. She professed our love and pleaded for a chance to make things right. I reminded her of that she was presented with the opportunity to salvage my dignity by disclosing the whereabouts of the other individuals involved, but she declined. I informed her that I required time to ascertain my emotions. She implored me not to abandon our prospective future together, acknowledging her misstep. I underscored the gravity of her actions and requested that she depart so that I might process the situation. Christy departed with a dejected demeanor after a brief exchange with Liz in the kitchen. I remained in the living room while they conversed. Christy subsequently departed, pausing briefly at the door to inform me of her affection before doing so. As a result of this interaction, I experienced a weakening of my resolve, which led me to sink onto the couch. Liz sat beside me while Chris stood in the hallway. Liz commended me for my ability to handle the situation well and thanked me for my kindness. She acknowledged that it was not an easy situation for me. I expressed my frustration, feeling that I did not deserve what had happened. Liz agreed, stating that I should not have to suffer as a result of this situation. She mentioned that Christy was also suffering, as she had not expected me to leave her over this. I inquired as to whether Christy had orchestrated this sequence of events, given the extent to which she could evade accountability. Liz elucidated that Christy only considered this possibility in retrospect. I then sought to understand the rationale behind Christy's actions, to which Liz responded that Christy had cited the temptation of being with someone well-owed as the primary motivator. I was further incensed to learn that Christy had not anticipated that I would be impeded by the bouncer. This revelation prompted me to question the nature of the sexual encounter, which I found to be either deplorable or, at the very least, unsatisfactory. I then posed the following dilemma to Liz: should I attempt to portray the incident in a more favorable light, or should I be candid in my assessment? This response seems to negate the initial question. Nevertheless, Henry, despite her assertion that the experience was mutually satisfying, maintains that she would never exchange what you two have for that. She characterizes it as a one-time encounter with no significant bearing on her relationship with you, yet she did, in fact, exchange me for that. She was not aware that this was what she was doing. We all make choices, and when we do, we accept the consequences, even if we do not anticipate them. Your assessment is accurate, but after she reflected on her actions, she still believed you too. She considered the possibility of moving past the incident. She reasoned that if she treated it casually, he would eventually forgive her. Kim and I shared this hope, but Chris and Heinz both disagreed. In retrospect, their assessment seems to have been correct. They have a deep understanding of my character. Liz, I am unable to envision a way to move past this incident. She was deliberate in her actions, leaving right in front of me and having me restrained so she could escape. She then called me to try to gain my approval. She had numerous opportunities to see that I was not okay with this, and she chose against me every time. I understand her rationale. It may appear otherwise, but she was not thinking rationally. It was akin to a momentary lapse in judgment. Have you ever experienced something similar, where you lost sight of the consequences? Liz, I appreciate you standing up for her. I am aware that you and she have become close friends, and I would not expect anything less. You are also my friend. Henry and I understand how much you care for her. Nevertheless, this situation is not comparable to when I stayed up all night playing video games instead of doing history. It is evident that her actions would lead to the outcome we are currently facing. You are correct in your assessment, but my heart tells me that you two are great together and that if you forgive her, you could be happy. Perhaps you are right, Liz, but I would likely spend my time worrying about what might happen next. I would be hesitant to go to a club again, fearing a repeat incident. If she is unable to control her impulses, am I supposed to accept that she made her decision and now I have to prioritize my well-being? Excuse me, I am fatigued and require rest. The remainder of the narrative, as related by Christ, follows a predictable trajectory. I acknowledge her efforts to reconcile, yet I remained reluctant. It was challenging because I still held feelings for her. When a marriage ends, it is not merely the dissolution of a partnership, it is also the loss of shared dreams, aspirations, and hopes. We had discussed having children, grandchildren, travel, and starting a family. These aspirations were now irrevocably lost. During these moments, the desire to remain together was strongest. Christ and I were in alignment regarding our dreams and aspirations. However, I was unable to overlook her actions. The divorce was finalized 3 months later. Christy requested a final conversation, stipulating no conditions. I consented to listen. Following the hearing, we met in a private room. Christ apologized to me, expressing regret for her actions and emphasizing that they did not reflect her love for me. She apologized once more, stating that she would regret it for the rest of her life. In response, I expressed my own regret, stating that I regretted the day I met her, proposed to her, and married her. I informed her that I was attempting to move on. Christ acknowledged my decision, expressing her contempt for me and hoping that I would utilize my cognitive abilities to make decisions rather than acting on impulses. I was emotionally distressed but remained silent, experiencing greater regret about the situation than my decisions. I left the room and we did not speak again or interact. It felt liberating. It was 3 months before I began going out again. I did not intend to meet anyone, but I was tired of remaining at home. I went out with Chris, Heinz, Liz, and Kim. They frequently introduced me to their friends, suggesting matchmaking, while I was not. I was prepared to enter into a committed relationship. I enjoyed socializing and allowed myself to engage in leisure activities without forming emotional attachments. While all of these individuals were pleasant, there was no sense of chemistry between us. When the evening concluded, our interactions also came to a close. I also developed a habit of going out on my own, finding solace in solitude. The club was busy, but I did not feel any obligation to interact with the other patrons. I enjoyed the company of Tasha, a bartender at the club where my life took a significant turn. She was a woman I had attended high school with. She had been employed at the club for some time, although she was not present on that occasion. On that particular night, we had only recently become acquainted, yet on the occasions when I entered the club alone, we began to develop a friendship. She made it clear that she was interested in pursuing a romantic relationship. Approximately 10 months after Christ had left the bar with his companions, I encountered them once more. They had returned to the club, presumably with the intention of repeating their previous actions. At that moment, they were simply sitting and drinking, scanning the room and likely searching for potential targets. I assumed that Tasha had noticed me looking in their direction and had asked about my interest. "Why are you staring?" At this point, she turned to Desmond and Richard, catching my attention. I was surprised that she knew their names. I turned back to her and she confirmed that they were regulars at the bar. I inquired as to whether she was acquainted with them. She responded in the negative, stating that she was not personally acquainted with them. When I mentioned that I thought they were from out of town and only visited occasionally for business, she corrected me, stating that they worked at a downtown supply warehouse near the freeway. She asked if they lived nearby. She confirmed that they had been living nearby for years, though she did not. She then proceeded to elucidate that they frequently visited the bar with the specific intention of initiating romantic encounters with other women and that they were indeed successful in this endeavor. She also made a point of mentioning that Richard was endowed in a rather impressive manner. I found her revelation about the bar being a popular venue for such encounters surprising, but she seemed entirely unaware of my thoughts on the matter. I then inquired as to the prevalence of single women at the bar. Tasha responded that they did indeed attract a considerable number of single women, but that they primarily did so in groups. However, she also noted that the men did not limit themselves to solely pursuing single women. Instead, they appeared to prefer married women. I attempted to conceal my disquiet at this revelation, expressing only my concern. I then commented that it had appeared to be a risky proposition. Tasha, however, was reassuring, stating that she doubted the husbands ever found out because the guys weren't the type to brag and the wives typically kept quiet about it. She did not seem bothered by the situation, seeing no damage in it. She reasoned that wives got to have some fun. The husbands remained unaware, so the situation did not damage them. She suggested that the husbands might even benefit from the situation by receiving good guilt-inducing lovemaking. As I pondered her words, I realized that nothing would happen between us if she was okay with others engaging in such behavior. It was likely that she would not hesitate to engage in such behavior herself, which was unfortunate. Tasha continued to speak when I did not respond, mentioning an incident where the men had attempted to seduce a woman while her husband was in another room. The situation had become quite intense and almost resulted in violence, so they had not attempted it again. She recounted that the wife had even asked Victor to restrain the husband so that she could leave with the men. I turned back to her slowly and she seemed to notice the expression on my face. She confirmed that Christ had indeed been involved in an affair. At that moment, she appeared to grasp the situation and expressed her dismay and regret. I rose from the bar and proceeded to the outdoors, seeking to remove myself from the conversation. I promptly made a telephone call to initiate proceedings, then settled outside to await developments. I had not previously recognized the extent to which I desired retribution until I learned that it was all a ruse. I was aware that Christ had accepted their invitation and that would not change. However, I believe she did so under the impression that they were merely a couple of individuals from town seeking a brief, inconsequential romantic encounter, one that would not result in any further contact, somehow made the act less wrong. I had singled out their vehicle in the parking lot, not to reinforce a stereotype, but when I observed the Cadillac with lowered suspension and flashy chrome rims, I was fairly certain it was theirs, as they had not yet commenced their search. I estimated that I had sufficient time before they emerged, unless they were fortunate and found success early. I was not privy to the events that transpired within the club, but it was nearly an hour before they finally emerged, accompanied by a woman they had evidently charmed inside. My assumption was correct. As they approached, I leaned against the driver's side door of the car. "Hey man," said Desmond, the apparent spokesman. "Mind taking your hands off my ride?" I addressed their slightly intoxicated companion. Ignoring him, I continued, I addressed their companion as much as she might deserve whatever consequences came her way. I didn't want to witness damage befall a woman, especially one whose husband didn't deserve it either. I could see the wedding ring from where I stood. "Oh yeah," I said, "I could see the wedding ring from here." In a tone that left no room for argument, I addressed her directly. "Sweetheart, you better find somewhere else to be." Perhaps she should return home to her husband, with whom she had vowed to forsake all others. I was uncertain as to her subsequent actions, but after assessing the situation, she elected to heed my counsel, departing for the club despite Desmond and Richard's objections. Once she left, the men directed their frustration toward me, questioning my motives for interfering with their plans. I calmly reminded them that the woman was her husband's property, and one of the men, recognizing me from our previous encounter approximately 10 months prior, realized that I was the husband of the woman who had approached him. They inquired about her whereabouts, expressing interest in another encounter. I informed them that she had moved on since then. When they asked if we had split up, I responded that I had no interest in her. After she had gone with them, they then questioned if I sought revenge as they advanced toward me. Their intentions became clear. They seemed to be focused solely on me, unaware of my friends closing in behind them. Suddenly, they found themselves restrained by 3 of my friends. Despite their struggles, they remained restrained. Rick was sufficiently robust to overpower them, and they were soon kneeling with their arms bound behind their backs. Their confidence rapidly diminished. One of them attempted to justify their actions, stating that they had simply made an offer and the woman had willingly accepted. In response, I stated that while I had initially been angry with her, my concern was now directed towards them and others like them who posed a threat to society. I was determined to ensure they never repeated such behavior. I instructed my friends to load them into Jed's pickup truck. The 2 individuals were secured by the group in case they attempted to escape. Approximately an hour later, we arrived at a secluded area in the county. We were guided by Jed, whose family owned a nearby farm. We reached a large grove of trees miles away from civilization and completely hidden from view. The captives were hauled out of the truck by the group, showing little care. I observed the fear in their eyes. They probably never imagined that their pursuit of casual lovemaking would result in such a predicament. They were facing unforeseen consequences, much like Christy. With a light-hearted tone, I pondered the best way to deal with them. I expressed my thoughts on how to deal with them, mentioning the possibility of castration followed by release. This elicited horror from them. I pointed out the potential complications if they sought medical attention after such an act. The group unanimously agreed on this point. However, my friends Desmond and Richard remained silent. I then mentioned the alternative option of taking in a tone that was both gentle and serious. I posed the question of how best to rid society of their carnivorous behavior. I put forth the idea of castration followed by release, which they regarded with horror. I then brought up the potential complications that might arise if they sought medical attention after such an act, to which they all agreed. However, my friends Desmond and Richard remained silent. I then suggested the alternative option of taking their lives to eliminate any witnesses, a suggestion that was met with disquiet from Desmond. Richard's expression suggested he might prefer to pass away over a life without his manhood. I commented on the absurdity of tying one's self-worth to the size of one's gonads. Desmond attempted to defend their actions, claiming it was just lovemaking and that the woman might have been with other men before. I rebuffed him, stating that my concern was not with her anymore but with them. I emphasized my frustration with men. I was of the opinion that these men believed they could seduce married women without facing any consequences. I felt it was time for them to learn a lesson and serve as an example to others. I signaled for the rest of the group to join me in a private huddle nearby. Our objective was simply to intimidate these men. I should note that I am not a violent person. Despite my desire to hurt these men, my intention was not to permanently harm them. We kept them on edge. For approximately an hour, we conveyed to them that we had reconsidered taking their lives or castrating them. Upon our return, their fight seemed to have dissipated. I informed them that I had been persuaded by my friends not to resort to taking their lives or castrating them. Instead, I outlined the consequences they would face, which included a severe beating. I made it clear that we would provide each other with aliases but warned them that if any police inquiries were made, if they were to be apprehended, they would be subject to the initial options. I emphasized that we would be monitoring them closely, having their addresses and workplaces from their driver's licenses. I issued a stern warning that if they ever targeted married women again, they would face severe consequences. Desmond inquired as to whether there was any way to avoid the beating. In response, I put forth a proposition, suggesting that they could avoid the punishment by engaging in a particular act. Desmond was eager to accept the proposal in order to avoid the beating. They did, in fact, receive the beating, with 10 of us present. We expressed our frustration in a controlled manner, ensuring that we did not inflict any fatal injuries. However, there were indeed some broken bones. We took care to avoid breaking ribs, as they could puncture lungs. At the very least, they will remember this for a long time. We drove them back to town and left them on the curb near a hospital. The following morning, we were featured in the news as 2 individuals who had been assaulted by unidentified assailants, possibly in the context of a failed robbery. The cases were subsequently dropped when the perpetrators claimed not to recognize their victims and believed the incident to be a random occurrence. 1 year later, I have managed to maintain a certain degree of trust in women, although it has not been an easy process. I have been informed that I recently encountered an individual with whom I have commenced a romantic relationship. It is still in its infancy, but it appears to be progressing favorably. Desmond and Richard seem to have disappeared, at least from their previous employment at the warehouse and their respective residences. It is possible that they have relocated their scheme to another city. I am occasionally prompted to consider whether I should have dealt with those 2 individuals more definitively. This is a recurring thought, and I occasionally experience regret over my decision. I was compelled to identify a new social venue. Tasha became increasingly assertive, and my polite refusals were ineffective. Consequently, I informed her that I would not engage in any further romantic involvement with her, given her acceptance of her friend's infidelity. She attempted to persuade me that she would not engage in such behavior herself, but I was unconvinced. I would prefer to have 2 dogs rather than a romantic partner. I have not yet made any plans to date again, but I anticipate doing so at some point in the future.